Unknown to the rest of the world, there's a violent turf war happening in Chile. To truly understand it, you have to go all the way back to the 1500s, to the start of the Arauco War.
How did I come up with the story idea? How was it made? And then how was it produced? The way that this documentary was produced was much different than the way documentaries are normally produced, because I had already purchased my ticket for Chile before I knew that I was going to do this story. I was going down on a surf trip for my main sponsor, Patagonia, and I was traveling with my girlfriend, who's a talented videographer and photographer, and we were looking for interesting stories to pitch to Seeker while we were down there in Chile, and we came across one on this indigenous conflict happening in the southern region that one reporter had been tracking. His name is Nicholas Rios, and he works for CNN Chile. So we started digging around on the internet for current environmental and social stories. So we started doing more research about what was happening. Whenever I go on a surf trip or am traveling anywhere, I love to learn about the country that I'm going. I love to learn about the history and the culture, and I find that a lot of times looking at a current regional story in that area is a really good way to learn about the country as a whole. It's hard to say like how or why I really follow certain stories, but I was very curious about that region. It's actually an area that's very similar to Santa Cruz, which is where I live. A reporter named Nicholas Rios, who's a Chilean journalist, had done on this indigenous conflict and how it had been happening for a few hundred years, but just in the last 3 or 4 had recently turned violent and scaled up in intensity. We then rented a car and we drove into the Arauco region, where a number of Mapuche were on trial for participating in a peaceful protest the month prior. And we filmed the whole story in one day. It was a very long day, and it was very underexposed. We found 1 or 2 articles, but we didn't see anything in video format. It's a good question. There are always difficulties when doing documentary work. It's kind of the name of the game. You just accept that there are going to be things that go wrong. And the most difficult part for me during this story was the translation aspect. My Spanish isn't great, so normally when I'm on the ground, I can be thinking on my feet, thinking where the story should be going next. If one of the interview subjects says something, that might spark an idea for me to ask a question that could take the story down a new, interesting road. And because we had a translator, it just slowed everything down, and I had to do the interviews more just kind of hoping that we were getting stuff, and then listen back with a translator after the fact. So it was difficult because I couldn't think on my feet as well as I could if the story had been told in English, or if all the subjects had spoken English, or if I had spoken Spanish. That was tough. Also, I would say a difficulty around this story was that we didn't have adequate funding to make it happen. Everyone was working on a shoestring budget, and it's very difficult for me to ask for favors from people again and again when I know that they should be valued more. I think one of the reasons this story was successful is that Nicholas made sure that we got both sides of the story. This is a story about an indigenous conflict, and it's very easy to jump only in the corner of the indigenous groups, because there have been so many atrocities perpetrated against indigenous groups around the world. But I think that the reason this story works was because we got both sides of the story. Right now, there are Chilean farmers that have lived on this land that is in the conflict zone for 3 generations, and they're in the middle of this. And Mapuche are now demanding that they leave their homes and leave that land. So the fact that we were able to get interviews with both the farmers and the Mapuche, I think balanced it out in a way that the audience appreciated. So it was a good reminder for me how important it is to not become emotionally invested in one side or the other side, no matter how I might feel about indigenous conflicts around the world. It's a more effective storytelling technique to do your best to get all sides of the story. We use a Sony A7S with a 24 to 70 lens.